Today we're going to look at the first couple English settlements in Jamestown and New England. Starting off with Jamestown, we need to first ask ourselves the question, why are they successful? They are going to be the first successful attempt by the English, so what about them is going to make them successful? And how do they overcome the challenges that they faced in order to do it? Here are a couple people we can add to our list. Obviously, Queen Elizabeth is going to fall under politics and power. Sir Walter Raleigh is going to be significant for making this first attempt to settle what will become the English colonies. And then, of course, John Smith, who is going to lead the ultimately successful Jamestown. Now, I do want to take a moment and shout out this. In the course of American history, arguably not that significant. In terms of North Carolina history, a little bit more significant. And that is going to be the settlement that it becomes known as the Lost Colony. So Sir Walter Raleigh is going to head out on an expedition to try and create the first settlement. And they are going to go here in Roanoke in North Carolina. And ultimately, this is going to prove unsuccessful. They have some trouble in the beginning. John White goes out back to England to try and get some more supplies and be prepared and whatnot. There's a war with Spain. He can't come over for a couple years. By the time he comes back, everything is gone except for a tree that has the word Croatoan carved into it. Now, Croatoan was kind of their danger word, and so if something was going wrong, that's what they were supposed to leave a note of. There are a lot of theories as to what could happen. One of the theories is the natives killed them all. And you go, all right, where are the bodies? Where are the buildings? Those sort of things. Another thing that could happen was, well, what if a hurricane came through and destroyed them? Okay, well, where are the buildings? Where are the bodies? Wouldn't they be somewhere? The most prevailing hypothesis is that they ran into trouble and not forcibly, but were then forced to assimilate with the Native Americans. Earlier in the 1900s, you're going to see the discovery of what are called the Dare Stones. So Virginia Dare is the first child born for the New World. A guy is out looking in North Carolina and he finds this stone and it's got these etchings on it and it's signed Virginia Dare and it's describing about how they're about to leave the colony attempt at Roanoke and they're about to go with the natives. And so archaeologists are super excited, historians are excited, they start doing looking into it, whole big bunch of discovery. Oh wait, they find another and they find another and they start tracking it across this journey. I do want to pause here and point out that the same person found every stone. Yes, he was making them up. It's not real. So those actually mean nothing. If you're upset that I've wasted your time in telling you about that, I sat through a speech in college that was an hour and a half on just that. So you're welcome for making it shorter. All right, let's talk about the people actually leaving England. What types of Englishmen settle in the New World and why? So first, we need to talk about competition with the Spanish. Obviously, as you can see in the picture, this is focusing on religious competition. There is going to be this kind of war, we'll say, between Protestants and Catholicism, and there is a showdown over who is more significant in Europe. And one of the ways you showed your value and your worth as a country was to have colonies. And so Spain had some, so now England needs to do it. Another problem they run into, and this image is from your textbook, 10 of 10, strongly recommend this image, so this is focusing on masterless men. So there is a kind of procedure in place in England with apprenticeships where you will decide, I'm going to work with this master, I'm going to get better at this craft, I will get the skills, and then I will have kind of this foothold in society. And so this is a question of, what about those people who are masterless men? They are men who don't have that. So we need to hear in terms of that, we need to think poverty, obviously homelessness. You can see here all sorts of just debauchery everywhere. And so the concern is, what do we do with these people who are just so terrible and they're draining our nation? And the simple answer is get rid of them. I would like to include, this is true, Nevada, specifically Las Vegas. They take up the homeless people who are in Las Vegas and they buy them a bus ticket and they bus them into California and drop them off. And they're like, all right, bye. And that's how they deal with homelessness. That's how England is going to take about this. They're going to go, ooh, what if we found a way to get those people away and go do something else? And so you are going to see those types of people be ones likely to leave to the New World. Another problem that you're going to run into, and I specifically have this under poverty, not just this masterless men, but poverty in general. You had what's called the fencing in of the commons, and essentially there was this area in different towns and villages and whatnot that was a common space. And it was something where everybody could work it together. And that would allow you as a poor person to have some land so that you could do something. And what happens is those start getting fenced up. This is the enclosure movement. We're going to enclose that. Now you don't have access to it, which then forces those people into poverty. They then flood to the cities. Boom, you run into another problem like this. Ah, crap, what do you do with them? Here's a good one. Get rid of them, send them somewhere else. So just take a second, pause the video, think about what you know about Jamestown. You should have done some reading. I hope you did. But you also probably have some background knowledge. So just take a second and think about that. So the actual settlement at Jamestown is off to a rocky start, shall we say. Basically, they stop wherever they find the most convenient land, and they're like, all right, great, we're done. And they get off the boat. And they settled in a bunch of swamps, which is terrible if you're going to grow things. And growing things is important for living. And so they basically show up, they're in a swamp, not great, diseases, poor health from that, and then of course not being able to grow things. But also the people who come over predominantly are gentlemen. Their idea is we're gonna go out, there's a whole bunch of gold everywhere, we're gonna find all that gold, we're gonna harvest it, mine it every day. After a while, we're gonna bring it all back to the ship, we're gonna head on back and make a whole bunch of money. And that doesn't happen. But they still try it. They're still going out every day, and they're like, well, let me try and find this. And what happens is no one's building, shelter, no one's growing food, no one's preparing for anything, and that's bad. Now, they enter a period of time called the starving time, which is during the winter, and they starve. There's actually some interesting stories about them turning to cannibalism. One guy was found, his wife had died, and he'd kind of like tucked her away, and he was just like eating off her. And so they found him and they were like, hey, you can't do that. And they killed him. So cannibalism is bad. Another problem they ran into was they settled directly in the middle of the Powhatan Native Americans tribal land, which that's just a bad look. The natives, if they're living and they just watch you come in and, park in the middle of their land and be like, we live here now, they're not going to take kindly to that. So you see some tension back and forth. So in general, things aren't great. I will take this moment to point out Powhatan had a daughter. His daughter is Pocahontas. I'm sure you've heard the story of Pocahontas. The story being that John Smith gets captured and he's brought before this tribunal, and the chief Powhatan is like, all right, kill him. And they're gonna kill him, and then Pocahontas throws herself on him and is like, no, don't kill him, I love him. Right? The story. So the reality really isn't like that. It mostly was Chief Powhatan trying to show the Europeans and these colonists, hey, I'm in power here. And so he captured the leader of the other group and then went like he was gonna kill him, and then his daughter steps in to stop it, and he shows, all right, I have mercy. And so he doesn't provoke a war because he doesn't kill the leader, but he shows the leader, I could have if I wanted to, but I didn't. And so that is the truth of the story. But that doesn't make up for a good animated movie. John Smith is going to be the one who helps get Jamestown out of the dark days that it had in the beginning. And I know we mentioned as one of the questions earlier, how do they end up being successful? And we'll talk about the main reason in a second. But he does come up with a policy that is, he who does not work shall not eat. And so if you're not going to go out to better the broader community, you're not going out and harvesting or growing food, you're not out building stuff, then you're not going to get to eat from these communal things that we have. And he also works to trade with Powhatan to get access to corn and food that they desperately need. But the true success of Jamestown is going to come because of this, what is known as the golden weed, which you may have seen some of around North Carolina. This is tobacco. And tobacco is going to be a tremendous cash crop for the South in general, but particularly in Jamestown. See, tobacco has something that makes it really unique in that it's addictive. And so when you consume it, you want to consume more of it. It also requires a certain climate to grow. We're looking here a little bit in our geography and the environment. And you can't grow that in England or Europe. And so they need to resort to the colonies. And now the colonists have something that Europe wants, and it's that tobacco. So the question we have here, how did tobacco alter the development of the southern colonies? And this is where we get into this idea of geography and the environment. How is society, southern colonies, the cities, all of this being built around tobacco. And we're going to see a really significant impact in lots of these different things. When it comes to work exchange and technology, there's going to be a labor supply that's a problem. We're going to talk more about slavery in a future class day, but there is indentured servants who are going to be brought over from the New World. There's something called the headright system that is going to be where rich people are given 50 acres of land for every indentured servant they send over. We need a bunch of labor to grow this because it's fairly demanding. It also depletes the soil really quickly. So how much are we kind of destroying the soil? How much land do we need? We're going to look at plantations. All of that is because tobacco is so successful. Now let's apply it to the society. So here we have the social structure and a little bit of commentary on the government of Jamestown and the South. If we're looking here, you can see that plantation owners make up the top chunk. The more land you have, the more tobacco you can grow, the more money you can make, the more wealth and the higher status you get. So these plantation owners are at the top. Underneath them, you have small farmers. And there's some variation within that, right? These people probably have less land than these people up here, but it is determined by how much land you have. Now, they're free, they're not indentured servants, but it's based upon land. Here, the indentured servants, these are people under contract to keep working. They don't have land, so they don't have esteem or value in this structure. And then African slaves are also placed, well, not also, they are placed at the bottom, and they don't ever get to break out of this. So the other day we talked about how the social structure is and if you can move up about it. All right, if you're a small farmer, can you become a plantation owner? I mean, maybe, probably if you're here, maybe you could find your way up. Now there's movement within this. Maybe you start out with very little land and then you get a little bit more. If you're an indentured servant, you can move out of that because you can get out of your contract and then get a little bit of land, assuming you can. So there's some movement. But if you're a slave, there is no movement. You're not breaking out of that contract, so you're stuck here. So there's some movement, and it's determined by wealth, but there's also some inability to move, and that's determined by race. Now, the government is going to be built upon something called the House of Burgesses. This is a representative form of government, and this is going to be heavily dominated by the elites. There were property restrictions in how much land you needed in order to vote, and then there's also property restrictions in how much land you needed in order to run or hold an office. So when we talk about the political structure, it is going to be dominated by the people who are dominating the social structure. Did mention Pocahontas earlier, just want to include this image here. This is what Pocahontas really looked like. You can see this is what she looks like after going to Europe. So got some white culture thrown at her. They changed her name to Rebecca. She marries John Rolfe. John Rolfe is one of the people known for really starting the hybrid form of tobacco. She does not marry John Smith, which I think in the movie she does. Don't quote me on that. I haven't seen the movie, but yeah, John Rolfe. That's the one that she's married. There's Chief Powhatan on the other side. We talked about him. There's a little bit of back and forth, hot and cold action between the settlers of Jamestown and the Powhatan Native Americans. There's the first part of the antagonism around Pocahontas and John Smith. There's some peacefulness between John Smith and Powhatan in the trading. And then ultimately, Jamestown just keeps pushing back against the Native American landholdings. And finally, in 1622, the Powhatan Native Americans lead an uprising where they just start killing a bunch of settlers. All right, so now let's look at Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims. Question for us here: in what ways did the New England colonies develop differently than Jamestown, and what accounts for these differences? First, we need to talk about Plymouth. This is going to be the Pilgrims. I'm assuming this story you should know pretty well. This is the whole idea of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims, the first one's over. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Essentially, you have the Pilgrims, who are separatists. England had its own religion, and the Pilgrims are basically a very small subset of that, and they did not like the changes that were occurring, and they decided, you know what, we can't fix this. We need to leave England in order to practice our own religious faith. So there's a lot of argument around this American identity today about what makes you an American. And one of those core tenets is the idea of like freedom of religion. That's why we came here. And absolutely, they go to break away from the English rule on that. Now, they're still technically English. They still acknowledge the king has to give them the charter to go over, but they want to hold on to the ability to practice their own religion. Now, I would point out, if we're looking at differences, Jamestown is not built upon practice your own religion. They just wanted to make money. So when we look at America and we want to romanticize and be like, but freedoms. Well, sure, but there's also Jamestown and the South that doesn't quite line up with that. They are going to receive help from Native Americans. I want to shout out Massasoit specifically. He's going to teach them ways that they can grow corn in the not so great soil of New England. Fun fact for you, what you do is you dig a little hole, you put the corn kernels down there, you take a fish that you caught, cut it in half, put it on top, and then cover it up, and of course water it and whatnot. And then what happens is the fish breaks down and those nutrients go directly to where the corn is, and so that's what allows it to grow. So they're doing what's called subsistence farming, which is they came here for a reason. They're gonna come with families. You're not gonna see as much just straight up single young white men like you will in Jamestown. You're gonna see family units come over in these kind of organizations, and they're going to just grow food so that they can eat. Now the other side is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and this is going to be settled by Puritans. Now, Puritans are kind of like Pilgrims, and it's like this. All right, so let's break this down for a second. That's the Church of England, okay? All those people in Church of England. You then have a subgroup of that. These people are Puritans. Now, the Church of England was making some changes. There's obviously Reformation that always happens. There's reforms. And the Puritans are like, not really a super big fan of where it is, but I think we can change it. And within them, you have the Separatists, or the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims are the group that are like, nah, I don't think we can fix this. And so they're the ones who leave first, and then it's only going to be later when you see the Church of England actually switch over fully to Catholicism that the Puritans are also going to leave. So they're kind of similar to each other, but a little different in this case. So the Puritans finally decide, you know what, there's nothing we can do to fix this. They're going full Catholic, we're out. And so they leave. And they are led by a guy named John Winthrop, and they go on something that's called the Great Puritan Migration. Now they're coming over, again, religiously. That's the motivation for them. Not the economic factors, just straight up, we want to be able to practice our own religion. Now, when it comes to the government and society of these, first we'll start with the Pilgrims. They had something called the Mayflower Compact. And here's a quick little excerpt from it. And I know it's got a whole lot of text and a lot of things capitalized, but basically the gist of the Mayflower Compact is all the Pilgrims got together, the men, the male Pilgrims. They got together and they were like, we're in this together. The men, the women weren't allowed. So the men are together and they're like, these are the things that we are going to do. And they decide we are going to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Basically what they're saying is we're going to work together for the good of the group. Now I do want to take this moment. Let's connect that out to broader American society today, or in fact the world today, as we deal with a public health crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the question being, what is the purpose of society? Are we supposed to be working together and making sacrifices so that it's better for all of us collectively? Or do we reserve the right to run off and do our own thing and not? Well, I mean, I can't quite put this down under American national identity because it doesn't seem like all of America has that figured out. So this is some question about what's going on here, and while we base this upon what our future will be, there is a question now of like, well, how much do we actually embody that? On the other side, the Puritan life. The Puritans are like super religiously strict. Like, I mean, really religiously strict. An example I always use in American One is like, if you've ever gone to church and there's like an old lady there and she's like super militant and she's like, we don't do that. We don't wear shorts. We don't wear jeans. This is not whatever. That is the Puritan lifestyle. No drinking, no swearing, all the Bible, all the time. Now, I want to be clear, there are people who are going to come over and end up around the Puritans, and they're not really religious. They're like, no, dude, I just want to fish. Like, I don't want to do this. But overwhelmingly, you're going to see the Puritans in this kind of strict lifestyle. Their social hierarchy is the clergy on top, churchgoers, and then non-churchgoers at the bottom. Is there movement in that? Sure. Go to church, and you move up. If not, then you move down. This picture specifically is about the Salem witch trials. Very interesting little situation. Basically, everyone starts running around claiming each other as witches, and there weren't witches. So there's that. Nathaniel Hawthorne is a really good satirist for this time period, and specifically the Puritans. And so I want to read this quote to you. He said, quote, "The Puritans compressed whatever mirth and public joy they deemed allowable to human infirmity, thereby so far dispelling the customary cloud that, for the space of a single holiday, they appeared scarcely more grave than most other communities at a period of general affliction." So let's break this down a little bit here. Right? So the Puritans compressed whatever mirth and public joy they deemed allowable to human infirmity. So if you were infirmed, there was sickness going around, things were a problem, what level of public joy would you allow? And I would assume it'd be like very little, right? Because we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? You just don't casually get to walk around a bunch of people and be like, wow, look how great life is, we're doing great. No, it's like, well, no, things are bad. So he's saying that that joy, that amount, that little amount, is what they would have over a space of a single holiday, and that would be the equivalent to what every other community would have if there was a great affliction. So on their happiest, they're as mad or madder than any other group during the worst thing they've ever gone through. When it comes to New England's interaction with the Native Americans, it's also a little back and forth. They need the natives. They need Squanto and Massasoit to help them and actually get them established. Just like the Powhatan had to help the colonists in Jamestown. But just like in Jamestown, there is a problem later on. There's going to be something called the King Philip's War. Basically, there's this back and forth between, there's the Pequot War, the King Philip's War, this back and forth between New England settlers and the Native Americans. And definitively with King Philip's War, New England has been established that the English control this, and the Native Americans get pushed back. So if we're looking at this, in what ways did New England colonies develop differently than Jamestown? Well, there's a bunch. They're more religiously free. You could argue that there's a higher level of social mobility. They're not super focused on agriculture or economics. Those would be some differences. If we're looking at similarities, well, they both are kind of hot and cold with the natives, and they both have some idea of like the traditional elites, shall we say, so the clergy, the rich plantation owners, they're in power, whereas others aren't. When we think about what accounts for these differences, really there's two. One, what's your motivation? Why are you coming over? Are you coming over to make money, or are you coming over to escape something and just try and live a normal life? Another factor is geographically, what are you offered? In the South, you can grow tobacco. In New England, you can't. So, well, it doesn't matter if you're in New England and want to grow tobacco. That's not really an option. You have to do something differently. And so when we're looking at these combined, keep in mind, how is geography and the environment having an impact on this?